Good afternoon, everyone. And we're so happy that you could join us for this program on rebuilding after atrocities, accountability and reconstruction in Sinjar and well beyond Sinjar, since it's such a pervasive problem today. I'm Melanne Verveer, and I direct the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. And I especially want to welcome Ambassador George Sparber from the Embassy of Liechtenstein. His government has done a great deal of work in this space. And I want to welcome back Ambassador Steve Rapp, my former colleague at the State Department, who was the former ambassador for global criminal justice. As well as representatives from the other embassies are here. Our Georgetown ambassadors for the Institute, welcome to them, and to all of you for this very special program. Around the world, violent conflict and mass atrocities are devastating the lives of people and their communities. According to recent data, more than 110 million people have been driven from their homes, and many will not return for years to come, if ever. Conflict-related sexual violence continues to rise at an alarming rate, taking a terrible toll on women and children, especially women and girls, although men and boys have also been attacked. The long-term impacts of trauma, displacement, curtailed education, disrupted economies make post-conflict rebuilding exceedingly challenging. Moreover, the need for healthcare and psychological support for survivors is too often unavailable, and it is desperately needed. Impunity for these crimes leaves survivors without closure, as perpetrators are not held accountable. And all too often, the cycle of violence is repeated. This year marks the 10th anniversary of the Yazidi genocide, when ISIS murdered over 5,000 Yazidis, enslaved more than 6,000 women and children, subjecting them to unspeakable sexual violence, and displaced more than 400,000, and thousands are still missing. Although no longer does ISIS have control of Sinjar, the homeland of the Yazidi people in northern Iraq, over half of those displaced by the violence, however, have not returned home, and those that have returned, as you will hear today, are struggling. We are honored to be joined today by Nadia Murad, who is a leading advocate for survivors of genocide and sexual violence. In 2014, she was taken captive by ISIS, enslaved and subjected to horrific sexual violence. Her mother and 6 brothers were executed by ISIS. Nadia eventually managed to escape from ISIS captivity and has since become one of the most powerful advocates for justice for the Yazidi community. She wants the atrocities perpetrated against her people to be classified officially as war crimes. In 2016, she became the first UNODC Goodwill Ambassador for the dignity of survivors of human trafficking, a role she continues to play today. She won the Nobel Peace Prize for her efforts to end the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war and armed conflict. She titled her autobiography, "The Last Girl." When I asked her why, she told me she truly wants to be the last girl who ever has to be subjected to the violence that she was subjected to by ISIS. She's the president of Nadia's Initiative, which works to persuade governments and international organizations to support the sustainable redevelopment of the Yazidi homeland, as well as to support survivors of sexual violence all around the world. Today, the initiative is launching its report, one of the reasons we have come together, The report is called Rebuilding Amid the Ruins. It has done in collaboration with our institute, and we're very proud to have been able to work with Nadia's initiative on it. There's a QR code at your seats for your use to download the report. We are so happy to welcome Nadia back to Georgetown. She is a true woman of courage. Proudly, she was also the recipient of our Georgetown Hillary Clinton Award for advancing women, peace, and security. Please welcome Nadia Murad.
Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Ambassadors, dear friends, thank you for giving us your time and your support. And thank you to our friends and partners at Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security, not only for hosting this event, but for the work you have done with us on the status of Sinjar report. Thank you so much. With conflict raging in so many parts of the world, as peace seems more precarious than ever, I believe the story of Sinjar can provide some hope for those communities who have lost their homes and are now suffering as we did. When you are displaced or a refugee, home takes on new meaning. The longing for home, the ache in your heart, is not just for the loved ones you lost or the house you left behind. It is for the rhythms, routines, and jobs that bring purpose to your life, and the thousands of years of history, culture, and tradition that define and ground you. As you know, my home is in the Sinjar region of Iraq. If you had visited my village, Kojo, in Sinjar 10 years ago, you might have asked, how can people survive here with just a vast sky and empty land? But Yazidis have been farming peacefully in Sinjar for generations. Like any rural community, we were always busy. There were crops to plant and harvest, livestock to tend to, neighbors to rely on. There was always a festival or a wedding to look forward to. And we were surrounded by a network of supportive family and friends. By global standards, our community was not rich, but we were happy and we had purpose. It was this life that ISIS attempted to destroy in 2014. Through their campaign of mass murder and sexual violence, they tried to eradicate not only our lives, but our livelihoods and our culture. Families that survived the conflict were separated and displaced. Land was mined, polluted, and left unusable. Homes, schools, and health centers were turned to rubble. Hundreds of thousands of people were and continue to be severely traumatized. The suffering we endured should have been enough to make the world sit up and work tirelessly to ensure that it is never repeated. Yet, conflict and conflict-related sexual violence continues to bring terror and fear to families across the world. Millions of people are displaced, living in camps that are unsustainable on every single level. They are an incredibly expensive short-term solution for a long-term problem, offering neither hope nor future to the desperate people who are forced to call them home. I lived in a camp, and aside from the lack of privacy, education, and proper health care, what I found most shocking was the lack of purpose. There are no jobs, no way to stand on your own 2 feet, nothing to distract you from your trauma or give you reason to believe in a better future. This is particularly true for women who have little agency over their lives in these displacement camps. It has been 10 years since the genocide. Still, Yazidi families are stuck in these camps. It is a story that is repeated across the world. 22% of the entire world's population live in refugee camps. That is over 6 million people, and tens of millions more are displaced. Knowing that other countries are not willing to offer them a place to live, I firmly believe that the answer for them, morally, politically, and economically, is to rebuild their homes, to invest in the regeneration of their fractured communities, and to do this work for the long term, sustainably, with survivors leading the way. The genocide of 2014 was not the first time my community faced violence. In our long history, we have been attacked 74 times. Our ancestors could have left Sinjar, but they didn't. There may have only been a few hundred or a few thousands of them left, but they stayed and rebuilt, and so can we. Which is why, over the past few years, Nadia's initiative has been working first to demine and decontaminate the land, then to rebuild farms, supply electricity and running water. Now we have schools and kindergartens. This year, our brand new hospital and women's center will provide vital services and support to thousands of people. Slowly but surely, Yazidis and other communities are leaving the camps and returning home. But it is not easy. So many women have been widowed and left to provide for their families without the skill or education they need for such a task. That is why our program work has focused on giving women access not only to reparations, but also to professional and vocational courses. We focus on education so that women are less vulnerable to poverty and inequality. We are building our community from the ground up, giving survivors the tools they need for decades rather than days. And every time I visit Sinjar, I am inspired by the progress the returnees are making. In October, we opened the Yazidi Genocide Memorial. It is a beautiful space for Yazidis to mourn and to remember their loved ones. In fact, last week, it hosted a ceremony as more victims were identified and brought home for reburial. While we were there, I visited Verveer village, which is just a few miles up the road. Over tea, the village leader told me that so many families had returned, they needed more space in the schools. The progress there is extraordinary. I walked to the new Nadia's Initiative Sports Complex, full of the sounds of young people playing and thriving. I was immediately taken back to my childhood. I never could have imagined that our region could have a facility like this for young girls, somewhere to learn and just be free with friends. But that is what we have now in Sinjar, despite the mass of challenges that continue to face us as we rebuild. Our biggest challenge is scale and resources. What has been achieved so far is thanks only to the grit and determination of survivors, with support from the international community. It is time for the Iraqi government to step up and help create an environment into which returning survivors can live. There is not a single house in Sinjar that was left untouched by ISIS. And until there is proper shelter for every family, thousands will stay in tents in displacement camps, regardless of the schools or healthcare centers that are available in Sinjar. Imagine the heartache knowing that there is hope for your homeland, but that is not accessible to you. Knowing that you could run a bakery, a beauty salon, or a market stall, but your home is still rubble. And the support we need from our government doesn't just end with the provision of shelter, but with other necessities like security, infrastructure, and justice. These are all things that a post-conflict region needs to thrive. 10 years ago, my home Sinjar was in ruins. Everything I knew and loved had been destroyed. It was hard to think about the future, let alone a future there. In fact, when we started to rebuild, so many people told us not to bother, that it was an impossible task. But Sinjar is reawakening. We have managed to give survivors and their families purpose and hope. There is now a blueprint of success. Sinjar shows us that post-conflict regions can thrive. And I know future generations will be able to call Sinjar home. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nadia. I was just thinking about all the suffering that you personally experienced and your people, certainly. And yet you bring us a message of hope in terms of the future and the possibilities of rebuilding and the work that still needs to be done. And that's some of what we want to talk about today. And so joining Nadia on our panel is the U.S. Ambassador at Large for Global Criminal Justice, Dr. Beth Van Schaack. Beth, why don't you come up? Ambassador Van Schaack advises the Secretary of State and other officials on issues related to preventing of and response to atrocity crimes, including war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Earlier, she was visiting professor in human rights at Stanford Law School. She was also directed while there the law school's International Human Rights and Conflict Resolution Clinic. She served as academic advisor to the U.S. Interagency Delegation to the International Criminal Court Review Conference and has served in several other critical positions. She's practiced law and has worked with the Office of the Prosecutor of the ICC's Tribunal for Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia. So Beth has an awful lot of experience in this area, and Ambassador, we are so happy you're with us today. Also joining the panel is Elisa Massimino, the Executive Director of the Human Rights Institute at the Georgetown University Law Center. She recently served as the Robert Drinan Chair in Human Rights and is a Senior Fellow in National Security and International Policy at the Center for American Progress. Before joining Georgetown, she was a senior fellow with the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard's Kennedy School. She spent 27 years, the last decade of those, as president and CEO of Human Rights First, one of the nation's leading human rights advocacy organizations. And Elisa, we are so happy that you could be with us as well and bring the Georgetown connection. So now we will begin, and please welcome the two additions to our panel with Nadia here. So, Ambassador Van Schaack, why don't we start with you? And I'm sure many who don't know are probably wondering, what does your office do? And what role does it have in our foreign policy, particularly on this range of issues?
Sure. I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you so much for joining. It's such an important initiative. And Nadia, the work that you have done, you've actually transformed the field from when I started in this field. Your attention to survivor-centered approaches, to trauma-informed approaches, has, I think, really transformed the way we do this work. So I want to thank you for all of the impacts that you've made on this, and you know, not only for your own community, but for other communities experiencing violence when we're trying to create an appropriate justice response. So yes, this office was the brainchild of Madeleine Albright when she was Secretary of State. This was at a time when the Security Council was actually functioning. I know that seems nostalgic at this point. You know, the Soviet Union had collapsed, Russia had assumed the seat, and was sort of willing to go along with some initiatives at the multilateral level. And so when the war broke out in the former Yugoslavia, the response was a justice response. This was new, it had never been done, and created a huge amount of litigation at the Yugoslavia War Crimes Tribunal to challenge that very concept, that justice was a part of peace and security. And that's what the Security Council is charged with promoting, of course. Then the genocide happened in Rwanda a year later, and so Madeleine Albright had the brilliant idea that she needed a point office within the State Department reporting directly to the Secretary, who would channel our support to these institutions. She was very dedicated to seeing them succeed, and that support included everything from diplomatic support, financial support, seconding personnel, etc. So over the years, this office's mandate has expanded somewhat, and under Secretary Clinton, she recognized that much of this work now is being done at the national level. It's not just ad hoc tribunals. And in fact, a sort of tribunal fatigue had set in at the United Nations, and the Security Council was not nearly as functional as it had been in the mid-90s. And so there was a recognition that there was more that governments could do to invest in this work at the national level, and that there were a number of societies that were emerging from situations of conflict, of repression, that were engaging in a transitional justice process that was comprehensive, that included truth-telling exercises, memorialization, as you mentioned, lustrations, removing individuals from power who were associated with violence, and other guarantees of non-repetition around institutional reform, etc. And so the mandate of our office expanded to basically provide advice to the Secretary, to our embassies and posts, whose host country may be experiencing some of these conversations around transitional justice. But then we've retained our old role of working with institutions that are trying to deliver justice at the international level.
Great overview. Thank you for that. Nadia, we just heard some of what the ambassador and her office do. We have a report that you have released today, Nadia's Initiatives Report. Give us just a very brief snapshot of what's in the report. You've told us some about what has been going on today in Sinjar. You gave us a message of hope in many ways, but I know there are many challenges that continue and concerns that you have. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the report is really, really goes in depth into, capturing the current situation, current needs in Sinjar. For example, the 150,000 people that have returned to Sinjar, not only Yazidis, but also other minorities, other groups that have returned to Sinjar. The 200,000 people that are still internally displaced in Kurdistan region, why they are there. And the report provide a number of reasons why these people are still displaced 10 years later, what is preventing them from going back. But, overall, the report also, highlights that what have been done in Sinjar. For example, when I first started doing this work, my goal was to share my story so the world will, act and will rescue the ones that were thousands of women and girls that were still missing in captivity and hold ISIS members accountable. I didn't know that, that later I will, found the Nadia's initiative and then rebuild until I really lived in the camps. And the camp that I was in northern Iraq was, there were more than 12,000 people, and the lack of privacy, of education, jobs was just really adding more trauma to what we have already been through. But I also met so many survivors in the camps who were, after they survived captivity, they were really looking forward to go home, to have privacy and support to recover and heal, and not just being left behind in a camp with thousands of people without the basic services. And camps are not sustainable. Anybody that is working in the camps, they know that they're not sustainable. You can't have a community. You can't build a community in the camps. Everything is temporary. There is no hope. I lived in the camps for almost 9 months, and nobody who visited me in the camp told me that there is hope for you in this camp. You will make it out. I didn't know what I was doing. I was just waiting for the day to get over. I had nothing to do. I couldn't even, so many times, even though I did share my story, but I was not always safe. I didn't feel safe to share my story. So many other people were, smugglers will come to the camps and tell them, if you stay in the camps, and pay us, and within 1 week we will take you to Germany. And then they, take advantage of people staying in the camps. Camps are good when there is an emergency, when the conflicts are, new, they're good, but not for long term, not for decades. Yazidis are not even refugees. They're only 1 hour, few hours, 1 or 2 hours away from their homeland. They go and visit Sinjar. They go to their, cemeteries, visit family, friends in Sinjar, and then go back to the camps because they don't have enough support to rebuild their homes. Every house was destroyed. My own village, for example, almost the entire male population was murdered. And right now, what we have, people who have survived are mostly women with children, and they can't rebuild their homes. We need more support from the Iraqi government, reparations, and for people to be able to go back. And we also know, and you all know, that countries and the topic of refugees is not one that people really want to talk about it. No country is ready. I have been all over the world, and I tell leaders that I will be happy to help you if you can legally bring Yazidis to your country, but nobody offers me that option. And I think it is on us to it is our responsibility to tell these displaced people that you don't have a chance to go to America or Germany. Right now, Germany is they have passed a law or something with the Iraqi government, an agreement that they're sending Yazidis back to the camps who have they don't even have home. So I believe we need to rebuild, and the report is highlighting this, that post-conflict regions, whether it's Sinjar, it's now we have conflict in Sudan. I was in Ukraine last year, and it is so important that we think of a long-term solution after the conflict is end.
You're exactly right. And I hope everybody here will download the report, because it's really worth getting the full perspective on what's happening. and what needs to be done. So we've talked about the important role that levers of government can play. Elisa, you're at the Georgetown Law Center. I know that your students have been involved on this issue, that they've been involved in working with survivor communities. Tell us a little bit about that, because we have a room full of students who certainly will do their part, I hope, in the days and months to come. And also, I know you've worked a little bit with Nadia's initiative. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Melanne. You know, I'm sitting here listening to all of you and thinking back to the UN resolution on women, peace, and security that you were such a pioneer in establishing, and thinking how, Nadia, you really are the embodiment of the principles in that resolution about the role that women must play in conflict prevention, in rebuilding, and it's just extraordinary what you've been able to do against so many odds. So this really feels like a very unified discussion here. And, you know, so at the Law Center, we were incredibly fortunate with my colleagues who are actually here, Michelle Liu and Catherine Cooper, designed a new experiential learning course last year, last academic year, that was designed to engage students in the really challenging real-world problems that you have just laid out, Nadia, the complexity of issues that are embodied in the situation of the Yazidi people, and we were so fortunate to be able to partner with Nadia and her organization to support their advocacy goals. So the students, one of whom, at least one of whom is here, Nicholas Friedlich, who took on one of the most challenging pieces of that puzzle, worked over the course of a year to support all of the priorities of Nadia's initiative. We had 3 teams of students who worked on different parts of the puzzle, one focusing on avenues for accountability and justice and prosecutions of perpetrators of these horrific crimes. Another looked at ways that the United States can be more supportive as a government and as a country of the needs of the Yazidi people, including, you know, the possibility of prosecutions here in the United States if that were to become a possibility, better service to potential refugees if there are people who don't have a way to go home. But most importantly, I think, was looking at the financial support of the U.S. government to rebuild the Sinjar, the Yazidi homeland, and how incredibly difficult it has been to manage the flow of resources and get it into the hands of the right people in Sinjar and around who are reflecting the voices and the needs of the survivors in the community. This is a really difficult challenge because your government bureaucracy is huge and slow-moving and tends to work with big outside contractors. I was just at a meeting last week looking at a new program at USAID to surge funding to democratic bright spots and how to support newly democratic states. And in that context as well, the biggest problem that people raised was the procurement reform at USAID, which is something that we learned a lot about in working on the project for Nadia's initiative. And then the third team really looked at the legal and societal barriers to the reintegration of Yazidi families into a normal life in Iraq, and in particular looking at the situation of women who suffered sexual violence and the children that were born of that crime, and the Iraqi laws that impede their integration into back into Iraqi society, and proposed a number of legal reforms that need to happen to help make that piece of the puzzle work better. And then we were incredibly honored to have Nadia as our keynote speaker at our annual Samuel Dash conference on human rights, where we focused on the broader issue of conflict-related sexual violence, and in particular, what it really means to center the voices of survivors in the strategies to deal with the aftermath of sexual violence, but then also to prevent that from happening in the future, which I know is your key goal, Nadia. So it was there's a wide range of potential learning opportunities for students and engagement. As you said, Nadia, this is a long struggle, and we need to be constantly feeding new energy into the fight, and Georgetown is full of that. So students are really on fire, I think, to get engaged in all of these issues.
Well, and that engagement is clearly needed, so we all can find a role for ourselves in dealing with this issue. But Ambassador, one of the biggest problems is how to hold perpetrators of these crimes accountable. And it's not just in Sinjar and what happened under the Yazidis, but we all know how many places are dealing with the same problem and how much there has been in the past that is still going unaddressed. In Bosnia, for example, so many of these crimes, in fact, the perpetrators have basically said it didn't happen, and yet the women who've been afflicted are suffering to this day. I remember being in Bosnia when our ambassador at the time said to me, "Will you meet with a woman here who wants to speak to you?" And when she did, her eyes were downcast, and she was almost embarrassed at what she was going to say to me. And she said that she had been raped during the war, and she has no peace in her life all these years later. And her perpetrator is the policeman at the corner, who is highly respected and honored in the community. So the perpetrators continue not to pay a price for the most part. So tell us a little bit about what mechanisms exist to deal with this problem. How can it be strengthened? What more can happen that could actually work? And how is your office working to address this?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. So part of my job is to look for ways for the United States, working with partners, and I want to acknowledge Liechtenstein, which really punches above its weight in this space, incredibly influential state, puts forward a number of experts that are promoting a lot of these initiatives around the world, and it's really lovely to always be able to partner with you. But it's to strengthen the full ecosystem, and I'm borrowing a word from my former boss who coined the term, of international justice, which is happening at multiple levels, which I've already mentioned. National courts, hybrid courts, where there's a mix of international and national levels, things happening on the national level, transitional justice, etc. When you scan that ecosystem, the situation of the Yazidis really falls short, you realize. There's no natural plenary ICC jurisdiction. Neither Iraq nor Syria is a member, so no territorial jurisdiction. There are some foreign fighters who have joined ISIS who hail from ICC states, so there might be some form of nationality jurisdiction there, but not necessarily the leaders of ISIS. And so the prosecutor, notwithstanding receiving a number of petitions from groups like Yazda and others representing survivors, has so far declined to move forward. They don't really feel like they have a sufficient jurisdictional basis to proceed. There was some energy, including with Nadia's lawyer and partner, Amal Clooney, to establish some sort of an ad hoc tribunal devoted to the situation of the Yazidi and other victims of ISIL, but that never developed the political will to move forward. So what we have seen is that national courts around the world are really stepping up and utilizing extraterritorial principles of jurisdiction, like universal jurisdiction, to pursue justice. And it's often situations like you described, where a survivor who may be a refugee in Germany is at the local market, looks up and sees across the market the persecutor, the person who held them custody, the person who raped them, the person who tortured them, or they recognize the person as having been a perpetrator. And because some of these states have developed trusted relationships with diaspora communities and law enforcement, those survivors feel comfortable coming forward and saying, I don't know if you can do anything about this, but I just saw somebody in the market who is a torturer and who should not be living here in peace. And so those public-private relationships have been developed, and they're very fruitful. And it really hinges on the ability of groups like Yazda that are survivor-run, that are grounded in those communities. They have the trust and the ability to work with law enforcement to bring these cases to their attention. So we have now seen a number of cases across Europe against ISIL perpetrators involving Yazidi victims, including one of the first genocide prosecutions in Germany. So that's the bright spot. The natural place for jurisdiction, of course, would be Iraq. Iraq, however, does not have within its domestic code the ability to prosecute international crimes. So that to the extent that they are bringing these cases, they're doing so under terrorism provisions, which doesn't capture the Yazidi experience. Terrorism tends to be conceptualized as a sort of crime against national security, right? It's not necessarily a crime against a protected or a vulnerable group in a way that we think about genocide or crimes against humanity. So one of our, consistent bilateral advocacy points with the government of Iraq has been to enact a law and to find clever and constitutional ways to make that law retroactive, because these prohibitions are not new. They have existed in the law for decades now. And there was the Iraqi High Tribunal, which, with all of its faults, nonetheless grounded these prohibitions in Iraqi law. So there is no ex post facto problem here. So it is ultimately Iraq's responsibility as the nationality state to deliver justice to its citizens. And to date, it has not been able to do so because it doesn't have the law. Now, undergirding all of these various efforts is a UN entity called UNITAD, which was formed by the Security Council in 2017. This was meant to be a sort of clearinghouse of evidence focused on ISIL and Daesh, aka, Daesh is the D in the word. And the idea was to work with documenters, national level, international documenters like Human Rights First, or very grassroots documenters, collect information, analyze it, create chains of command, theories of responsibility, thinking through the genocide, arguments, how to make that with the evidence that's available, how to make out such claims, and then support national prosecutions wherever those crimes are at issue. And UNITAD has been incredibly impactful in this regard. Now, unfortunately, when its mandate came up earlier last year, the government of Iraq, in somewhat of a surprise move, basically wrote to the Security Council and said, don't extend the mandate. We don't need this anymore. It's not sharing sufficient information with us. It shouldn't be advanced. And so, unfortunately, members of the Security Council did not want to go against the government of Iraq, and so now it has been extended for one more year, and we're looking at what UNITAD 2.0 looks like. Some issues to bear in mind as we're considering this is, number one, we have to find ways to make that information continue to be available, because these cases are still emerging. Even now, a decade later, we're finding and identifying perpetrators. And so we can't have the archives of UNITAD just end up in a basement somewhere in New York at the UN headquarters. And number two, a number of survivors gave testimony to UNITAD under very strict informed consent protocols. And this is very much because UNITAD adopted the Murad Code, which sets forth this as the best standard. And so those testimonies cannot be shared with the government of Iraq without the informed consent of the survivors who gave those testimonies. And Iraq wants that information, so we need to find a way to anonymize that information or otherwise go back and get the informed consent of those individuals before that information is shared. So this is the challenge now that is facing the Security Council, as we have now a year, essentially less than a year at this point, to wind down the affairs of UNITAD and come up with some sort of residual or follow-on mechanism so that all of the good work that UNITAD has done and all of the investment that survivors have made in creating this database and this clearinghouse of information does not go for naught. So that's one of the things that our office is working on, and my colleague Susan Notar is here, who's worked on these issues for many, many years.
You see how difficult this is, and yet it's work that must be done. Nadia, the ambassador just talked about accountability for perpetrators of these crimes. When we talk about rebuilding in situations like Sinjar and what the Yazidis have experienced, we often think of the bricks and mortar, moving people from the refugee camps and an existence that's not sustainable or should never be, to being back in their homes that are the right places for them to be and to prosper again. What about the survivors? Elisa mentioned survivor-centered assistance and support. what is going to be done? What are you recommending? What is happening in terms of factoring in the survivors and their needs in the reconstruction of Sinjar?
Well, I think first there were a few good points I just want to comment on them about accountability, because it's really what we do and what we've been doing with, our lawyers like Amal Clooney and others. I think it's not that difficult if you look at what Germany did. Iraq is just not interested in what happened to Yazidis, and that is the point. For example, Iraq is saying that UNITAD's mandate should be, it's over and they should leave. But where? I'm a survivor. It's been in less than, 7 months. It will be 10 years. And I am still waiting for my mother and my brothers and my nieces and cousins to be identified and brought home for a burial, for my family to get some closure. We still have tens of mass graves all over Sinjar that yet need to be exhumed. Families have, the way that Iraqi government and the legal system is working on, cases, ISIS cases, they have been charged some, they have charged some ISIS members based on, members of a terrorist group, but not for sexual violence or genocide. And we don't know anything about the process. There's no transparency. Survivors are not involved in the process at all. How can you tell, UNITAD and others to just leave all this evidence that we have worked on for years now, to give them to Iraqi when survivors don't really trust the Iraqi system? And that is why Amal and we have, shared a proposal with the U.S. government and other, UN members to have to put ISIS on trial and having a hybrid court. Or we've been also working on countries like Netherlands, who have so many nationals who went and joined ISIS. UNITAD has a list of hundreds of ISIS members, their full names who are not Iraqis, their information, their involvement in the Yazidi genocide. And what we really need is their, countries of nation to hold them accountable. Germany has done it. The first case in Germany, the victim was my cousin. And what she told me, she said, I didn't come forward just for me. I want this to be prevented from happening again. And she also said that she didn't just come forward to hold the ISIS member accountable just because he killed her daughter that was few years old. She said, but because of the way that he tortured us while she was alive. There are so many reasons that survivors don't trust the Iraqi system. You mentioned the children born in captivity. It was difficult, and it is difficult on the Yazidi community to welcome these children for so many different reasons. For example, if I tell my family, if one of my family members had a child from ISIS, if I tell them to take care of them, Yazidis are in camps without any support. They can't even take care of their own children. And you just want some survivors who have been sexually abused for years to take the responsibility and, raise children in the camps without, any support. That is not the best solution. On the other hand, if some Yazidis, let's say some Yazidis would say, okay, when mothers can bring their children, the Iraqi system is very open about, what they have decided. The children will be registered as Muslims even if the father is ISIS. And that is hard for the Yazidi families because they think that if they take the children and register them as Muslims, and we know so many of our neighbors joined ISIS, and we know so many of them just walked free when ISIS was defeated. Maybe 5-10 years from now, they will come back and ask to take back their children. Then how can you deal with that? There are so many, ways that so many reasons that the community cannot take them, but also the Iraqi government is not helping, on any way, and especially women. I mean, it is the mothers, and so many of them, they the reason they tell me so many times that the only thing that was giving them hope was these children. They felt responsible to save them and rescue them. And then the Iraq is not giving the mothers any, decisions, any power, the rights to just keep the children. But then, on the other hand, Iraq is coming and saying that we will take care of what UNITAD has collected. But I don't trust them. I don't know if they take over, they will ever identify my mother or brothers, or will hold these who did this to my family or my neighbors accountable, specifically, charge them for sexual violence and genocide. They have not recognized the Yazidi genocide, while so many other countries have done. So we really need the international community, the UN and UNITAD team, to continue doing this work, because survivors gave their testimonies over and over again because they trusted UNITAD and this system, that one day they will have their day in court. And I think let me go back to your question.
I think this, really helping us deeply understand there are avenues to pursue.
Yes.
It's the lack of political will to pursue them,
yes,
and to do what needs to be done.
Exactly. And I mean, it's so clear that the way that Germany did, it's out there. Anyone can, follow the Germans' lead. It's just, it's the lack of political will. And, with the survivor, I think for this to happen, survivors and their families recovering from atrocities, they need to have an opportunity to participate in, the whole process from design to implementation when you are doing projects in Sinjar. That is what we're doing. Our approach and everything that we do on the ground is survivor-centered. We, as someone from there, I know, there are so many challenges and so many issues that you have to first, discuss with the community, talk to them, and everything that we have done in Sinjar, rebuilding tens of schools, hospital, healthcare centers, women's centers, small jobs, everything is led by survivors. They are included in the whole process because I believe in that, and I believe they have so much to provide, but it is also very important to follow the Murad Code guidelines, because it's so important to prioritize survivors' their well-being, to make sure that they are not re-traumatized because they've been through a lot. And that is what we're doing with people who, initiatives that are already working there, but our work overall, we try to do everything with them. Because at the end, it's these survivors and their families that will stay there and benefit from these projects. And I don't want to take, a project that that is something, an idea that is working in America, maybe it will not work in Sinjar. I don't want to take something and do it there and then just based on my thinking, but it's for them, and I want the community to, every project that we do, I want the community to benefit from it from a long term and not just, as I said, like the camps for days.
And the Murad Code is something that's really important. It's become the gold standard for how to work with survivors in these situations. Before we turn to some of the questions I've gotten from those of you sitting here, Elisa, you've been long engaged on human rights issues, and a lot of what we're talking about, particularly what's happening to survivors, is part of a bigger context, shall I say, that really goes back to the status of women in our societies and what allows these kinds of atrocities to occur in the first place. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as you know this very well, there is a cycle here of discrimination against women, devaluation of women in many societies around the world, and it creates, an enabling environment for vulnerability that then criminal governments or organizations like ISIL prey on, take advantage of, and then, as Nadia pointed out, the role of women in the camps and the way that the government in Iraq is viewing the rights and roles of Yazidi women, it creates this cycle of vulnerability that in many ways lays the foundation for future violence. So this is a broader cycle that we have to break. Some of those challenges are, legal reform that needs to happen. A lot of it is societal norms that need to change. And so much, Nadia, of what you're doing to create a zone of joy and safety for Yazidi girls is like it's the seed being planted for a better future in that society, and it's something that we have to do kind of across the board. There's a huge mismatch or disconnect between the investment that the global community makes in in documenting abuses and as in UNITAD, which is important. It's very important. But if you compare that to the level of seriousness of really delivering on the promises in the Genocide Convention, but also in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that to ensure the security and dignity of women in societies, that we need to fix that imbalance. We can have lots of governments declaring that the acts of ISIS were genocide, but then they have to follow up and put literally the money where their mouth is, and some governments are doing that a lot better than others. But these issues are all connected, I think, and you can also see it in the way in which governments have sort of lost interest in following through to identify, the missing from the Yazidi community, to bring women and children home and find ways for them to restart their lives in dignity. All of that, I think, is reflected in a devaluation of women in societies that is both the genesis of a lot of the violence, and also post-violence makes it difficult to rebuild. So we have a big task in front of us.
Thank you. This question has come up in varying ways from our audience, and whoever wants to answer it, if all of you want to make comments, that's fine too. But in addition to the criminal prosecutions, what other forms of transitional justice are necessary to really rebuild?
Yeah, I'd be happy to start. I'd love to hear from others on the panel, but I just want to call attention to the Yazidi Survivors Law, which was passed by Iraq, and it is supposed to provide a measure of reparation. And it has not been fully implemented, and it has not been fully funded. So I think we as an international community need to find creative ways to fund reparations so that we are delivering justice on the one hand, which has a symbolic and important benefit around closure, et cetera, but also enabling these survivor communities to get back on their feet, to rebuild their lives and their livelihoods, to send their children to school, to rebuild their homes when their homes have been completely destroyed. They cannot be expected to get back on their feet without material assistance. And so part of what my office is doing is looking for ways. We did a grant proposal for transformative reparations, and we've been able to fund the Global Survivors Fund, which you also initiated, once more, the impact that you've made on this globe, but other similar organizations that are looking for creative ways. We are in touch with Ambassador Rapp, who has a really interesting initiative. There was a French cement company, Lafarge, who was doing business in northern Syria, and in order to do so was paying ISIL and putting its own employees at great risk. They have now pled guilty to sanctions violations under U.S. law and have agreed to pay $700 million in fines and forfeitures. Now, those fines are statutorily mandated to go into a victim's fund that focuses on victims of crime in the United States. But the forfeitures there's much more fluidity there as to what can be done with that. Could we not figure out a way to put some of that money towards implementing the Yazidi Survivors Fund or towards organizations working in survivor communities so that people can get themselves back on their feet and rechart those life paths that were so disrupted by what happened in 2014. So that's one area that's not criminal accountability, but it's justice broadly defined. And I think it's the only way that communities can really heal and put some of the past behind them and rebuild their lives.
And it's so critical. These resources are so necessary. Yeah. Is there a role for advocacy in terms of this example?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's multiple ways that when pots of money are formed by virtue of fines, forfeitures, civil damages in lawsuits, could we not imagine a way in which the defendant, for in this case Lafarge, pled guilty? Could Lafarge not say, I'm going to put 10% of this towards the Yazidi community? And I imagine that our Department of Justice would be quite open to such an arrangement. They can't force it upon the company, but you could imagine building that into the settlement agreement. Now, what's interesting in that case as well is that France is using its universal jurisdiction law to prosecute the corporation criminally for what it did. And so there may be additional opportunities there to generate funding that could go towards the Yazidi community.
Oh, that's interesting. Nadia, have you talked to anybody in the French government? I know they've been very supportive of your efforts about this.
You know, Amal and I, we in December, we came together and we've been working on Lafarge case for a while. And for me, it was really shocking to read documents that were dated around the same time that my village was attacked, when Lafarge was making deals with ISIS, funding them right the same day that we were attacked. And it is so important for anyone, companies or governments, anyone that have that is funding ISIS and like-minded groups, to be held accountable. It's not only the perpetrators, but also those who fueled their war. For years, they paid millions of dollars. And now we are on the case and trying to sue them. And I work very closely with the French government, but it's really the company. It's the company that was doing all the work in Syria. It's the company that were making deals. We have evidence. We have evidence of documents that ISIS were sending to them and saying, you have to pay this much for our fighters, let's say in Sinjar or there, and they would do over and over again. So we're on the case, and we'll not give up on it because we have the evidence, all the evidence that we need.
And this is a case, is it, Ambassador, where universal jurisdiction can come into play or not?
This particular case doesn't require it. So because they breached U.S. sanctions, that just gives jurisdiction here, and that was the basis of the guilty plea, essentially. The company pled guilty and offered to pay in order to have the charges be dismissed. In France, it's a French company. So again, it's ordinary territorial nationality jurisdiction. There's nothing fancy here. It's not a universal jurisdiction case. But you can imagine other cases against other enablers, right? Who are the companies and organizations that provided weapons or that otherwise benefited financially with what ISIS was doing? And I think we've seen this all over the place. Central Africa is another great example where you have enormous resource extraction that's fueling atrocities. And it's not just the militia on the ground that are perpetrators here. There are other entities that are benefiting from the existence of the chaos on the ground, and they're backing different groups in order to be able to control certain areas. We as an international community have to get smarter about how to go after those enablers and to create accountability mechanisms to hold them responsible. And it's important too because they have resources in a way that militia on the ground don't necessarily have resources, right? So this is a way to bring resources to bear to help support survivor communities.
Yeah, genocide never happens in a vacuum. There is always a web of enablers, corporations, other governments, diplomatic enablers, security people. There is always a web, and we have to have a matching web of accountability that runs across all of these kinds of issues that you just heard about, whether it's civil liability and having the mechanisms to make sure that the money that gets collected through those lawsuits goes to the right place. That amount of money just from this single lawsuit could do so much for rebuilding Sinjar, and in a streamlined way that doesn't go through a huge amount of bureaucracy, could go directly to survivor-led groups who know what the needs are on the ground. So criminal liability, whether it's through an international tribunal or universal jurisdiction or every place in between, all of that creates the kind of web of accountability that has to match the web of enablers that make genocide possible.
So Nadia, we have several questions from the students with respect to your situation. One from Maria Gabriela, who's a global human development student. How have you been able to manage the pain and process of healing, given all that you've been through? And then a second question, what is your message to all of us students on how we can help you and the issues you've been struggling with?
Thank you. I think these are really important questions, but a little bit personal. I know I've been through a lot, but I'm also like always, I remind myself that I am one of the luckiest because I survived. When you survive a war and your best friends or your nieces and your mother, or they don't make it, you just feel the responsibility of doing something. Surviving, ISIS captivity, I thought that was my story of survival, and it will end as soon as I make it to Kurdistan, which was safe. But that was just a part, like a small part of surviving conflict and surviving a genocide. It's healing. I think it's different for everyone. For me, I really have a very supportive family. Those who have survived. I have many nieces and nephews. My husband. I have found purpose in life after I survived, that I can do something with my story, and that is why I always think that of the camps, that I don't think I could have made it, in the camp if I was still in the camps. I don't think I would have survived because there was just no purpose, and I'm a person that I cannot live without having purpose. And I think this is for all of you, no matter how small. Like growing up in Sinjar, my mother was a single mom. She raised 11 children on her own, but also my father's 4 children, my half-sisters and brothers who lost their mother. So totally we were 11, 12, 13, 15, children, and on a small farm. And we didn't have much every day, but every day I felt that I had purpose, going to the farm with them, working, making sure that we never rely on the UN or humanitarian aid or anything like that. And today I have, after surviving, I have found purpose in my life, that I know that I can do something good out of this horrible story, make sure that, that I can prevent this from happening. I remember when I went to Ukraine last year and I met survivors of sexual violence, conflict there. And some of them, they were there to just listen. Just like me, when I survived, they didn't know that there were survivors out there from other atrocities that have been sexually abused. They thought they were alone in their, story. And I thought the same in 2014. I didn't know about the outside world. And when I talked to them and they knew that I have made it and I'm sharing my story, and the shame and stigma and taboo is not it's not on me, it's on those who have done this. They started to talk and share their stories and what they have been through, and that they have friends is still, can't share their stories. So it's really important. I also, like many of you, I'm a student. I'm a senior. I will graduate this semester, and I think, that is also a way for me to send a message to ISIS and like-minded groups that women are strong, and that by just coming to my village and raping me or my friends, that does not mean, that is my end, and that we're strong and we have a story. And sometimes, you feel like women are so vulnerable that, and they are in so many communities, so many parts of the world, and that they can't, make a change. And I think that is what ISIS was trying to say, that bring, as many women as you can to sexual slavery, because they're nothing and they will never harm us. And today we, women, the first Yazidi women, was able to hold and, face her abuser in the court in Germany. And that is really big. That is a clear message, a strong message to send to ISIS, but also to prevent this from happening. We can't prevent sexual violence from happening again without accountability. Impunity should never be an option, and it has been for so long. But I think now we are, survivors are coming together, and that that's why we're asking that, accountability. Of course, I have other needs. Of course, I was not raised to be an activist. Of course, it's a long path. It's a path that I don't know if there is like an end to it. I have so many personal, issues with the war still. Just for 10 years, imagine going out there trying to change the world, but in your heart, you know that your mother is in a building in Baghdad. Also, my nieces. I have 6 sisters-in-law that are taking care of more than 18 children. Their husbands were killed. It's not that my family had recovered or I have recovered. I am healing and I'm recovering, but I also have hope that we can have a better world if we work together. We can have a safer world when women are at the center of what, we do, and not just, talking about them. In Iraq, and I know I went too long, but in Iraq for so long, people will go, government, leaders will go to the Iraqi government, or in Sudan, or in Ethiopia, in Afghanistan. They will talk about issues that were related to women, but women were not there. How can you make it happen if the women are not there? In Afghanistan today, millions of women are prevented from going to school, are preventing from socializing out there. This is, it's just like you said, it's on all of us. It is happening in your lifetime, in my lifetime. We're not talking about history. We're talking about events that are happening in our lifetime. And I think if we don't, work together and don't support each other, I don't think, the future generations will forgive us.
Nadia, you never have to worry about talking too long. And what you just said to us really has to be the last word of this gathering today, because it can't be improved by any other questions and answers, and besides, our time is up. But thank you. Thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for issuing a call to action to all of us. And wherever we sit, whatever we do, whatever our purpose is, I think you've not only made us smarter, but made us think deep inside of ourselves, are we doing enough? And what avenues can we pursue to really help the Yazidi people, what's still happening in Sinjar, to bring greater accountability for what's happening and what has happened to the survivors, and not just in Sinjar, but all over the world today, where this is such a big, big problem. So thank you for being Nadia Murad and for all you've done. And I absolutely want to thank the ambassador for dealing with these issues every single day and trying to move the needle as best as she can, and Elisa for all that you're doing over at the law school and what you've done to promote human rights for a long time. So thanks to everybody.